They thought a young police officer and her tiny K9 would be easy prey, but on a freezing Denver night, their cruelty awakened a force they never saw coming. A wounded Navy SEAL, trying to disappear from the world, was pulled back into battle by a single terrified scream, and a miracle waiting to happen. When the gang came to silence the truth, the storm broke open, and faith, courage, and fate collided in the snow. What happened next proves one thing. Even in the darkest places, God still sends warriors. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. The late afternoon sky over Denver hung low and heavy, the color of old steel, and the air carried the brittle chill of winter that crept into every crack between buildings. The Iron Horse Bar sat on the corner of an aging street, its neon sign flickering in defiance of the fading light. Inside, Ethan Cole nursed a lukewarm beer with his left hand. His right arm was wrapped tightly in a sling, bandaged from wrist to shoulder, the reminder of a mission that had gone wrong far from home, a mission that had cost him more than blood. His leave was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to let the doctors call him healed. But he knew better. Some wounds only looked better when you stopped looking at them. He had chosen this bar because it was quiet, a place where the music was low and no one asked questions about the way a man stared too long at nothing. The wood floors creaked with history, and the smell of old whiskey and rain-wet coats mingled with the faint hum of conversation. Outside, his dog Ranger waited near the truck, the German shepherd trained for war, who, like his master, did not know what to do with peace. Ethan's mind drifted. He thought of his last deployment, the explosion, the screams through the comms, the dead silence afterward. He had dragged himself and Ranger out of that burning compound by instinct, not will, ever since he had been haunted by the echo of things unfinished. A sudden commotion snapped him back. Shouting came from the alley beside the bar, sharp, desperate, not the kind of noise that belonged to the lazy hum of late afternoon. Ethan turned his head, listening. A woman's voice cut through the wind, steady but strained. "Police! Back away now!" Then came the cruel laughter of men who believed the law couldn't reach them. He stood up slowly, his injured arm throbbing as he reached for his jacket. His instincts, dulled by weeks of silence, woke up like a knife being unsheathed. He stepped outside, the cold biting his face. The sun had almost vanished, leaving the street washed in gray. In the alley near the bar's side entrance, 4 men surrounded a young police officer. They were Red Vipers. He recognized the tattoos, the colors. Denver's growing drug ring, violent, untouchable. Their leader, a stocky man with a permanent smirk, twirled a length of chain around his hand. The officer stood firm, even as fear trembled at the edge of her eyes. At her feet was a small dog, a shepherd pup, its stance tense, ready to fight despite its size. Ethan stopped short. The pup barked once, defiant, tiny, and heartbreakingly brave. The sound seemed to mock the men who turned their attention to it. "Look at this little thing," one sneered, drawing back his boot. The officer shouted, "No!" But the kick landed squarely, and the pup yelped, the sound slicing through the winter air like a wound. Another kick followed, then another. The little creature collapsed onto the cold asphalt, its breath shallow, its tail twitching once before going still. Something inside Ethan broke loose. For months he had fought the impulse to act, to let violence die with a uniform, but the sight of that small broken body lit the fuse buried deep within him. He crossed the street without a word, every step deliberate, the world narrowing to a tunnel. One of the gang members noticed him too late. "Hey, man, walk away." The rest of the sentence was drowned out by the crack of bone. Ethan's left fist met the man's jaw, the sound clean, efficient. Pain surged up his injured arm, but he ignored it, twisting his body to grab another attacker by the collar and drive him into the wall. Ranger, hearing the commotion, bolted from the truck and tore into the alley, a blur of muscle and fury. The leader swung his chain, but Ranger caught it mid-air, jaws clamping down, dragging the man off balance. Ethan moved like he had on deployment, controlled, ruthless, no wasted motion. It ended in less than 15 seconds. The men lay groaning in the slush, their arrogance bleeding out onto the pavement. The officer, Lena Brooks, according to the tag on her uniform, dropped to her knees beside the dog. "Scout," she whispered, pressing trembling fingers against its neck. The pup still breathed, barely. Her eyes shimmered with helpless fury. Ethan crouched beside her, his voice low. "There's a vet 2 blocks away. Move!" She looked up at him, startled by the calm in his tone, not soft, but steady, like someone who had seen too much to panic anymore. Together, they lifted Scout. The pup whimpered, a fragile sound that made Lena bite back tears. Ethan carried the dog with one arm, his injured hand pressed protectively over its ribs. They moved quickly, the cold biting through their clothes, the sirens of Denver far in the distance. As they passed the bar, Ethan glanced once through its dusty window, his untouched beer still sitting on the counter. The life he had tried to live quietly was over the moment he heard that yelp. He knew it even before the thought formed. Peace had never been made for men like him. Inside the clinic, the smell of antiseptic hit like a wave. The vet on duty, Dr. Eris Thorne, didn't waste time with questions. He took one look at the bleeding animal and shouted for supplies. Ethan stepped back, letting the professionals move. Lena stood frozen, her breath hitching, watching the small chest rise and fall in shallow rhythm. "He's just a rookie," she said softly, half to herself. "He just started with the unit." Ethan's gaze didn't leave the table. "He's got more fight in him than most people I know." Minutes passed in silence, punctuated by the metallic click of tools and the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. Ranger sat by the door, unblinking, ears perked, as if keeping watch over the entire room. When the vet finally spoke, his tone was grim but not hopeless. "He's alive. Barely. Broken ribs, internal bleeding. It'll take everything we've got." Lena nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Do it. Whatever it takes." She turned to Ethan then, truly looking at him for the first time, the steadiness, the controlled stillness of a man who had already made peace with violence. "Why did you help us?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes shifted to the small, fragile creature fighting for breath. Then he said quietly, "Because I couldn't not." Outside, the storm had begun again. Snow falling in soft, relentless silence, covering the blood in the alley and the footprints that led away from it. Inside the clinic, under the sterile light, 3 lives intersected. A wounded soldier, a weary cop, and a dog too small to matter in the eyes of the cruel. Yet somehow, the spark that began in that moment would ignite everything that followed. Night settled over Denver with a hard, crystalline quiet, the kind that made every sound feel amplified against the frozen air. Inside the emergency clinic, the fluorescent lights cast long, pale reflections across metal trays and tiled floors. Ethan Cole sat near the examination room door, his good hand resting on Ranger's head as the dog stood guard with an alert stillness that seemed carved out of habit rather than fear. Lena Brooks paced in a tight loop, her boots tapping a restless rhythm, every movement betraying the anxiety she tried so hard to keep contained. The memory of Scout's tiny body lying limp in her arms replayed in her mind in a relentless loop, layered over the laughter of the gang members, their taunts, their boots, the guilt pressed against her ribs as if trying to break them. Dr. Eris Thorne worked behind the closed doors with only a small team. Though the man had the calm air of someone used to emergencies, scars around his tone hinted at years of difficult cases, perhaps strays mauled by cars, police dogs injured in raids, or pets he couldn't save. He carried those ghosts quietly, and tonight Scout had become another soul he refused to hand over to the dark. The heart monitor beeped faintly from the other side, too slow, too fragile. Trying to distract herself, Lena sat beside Ethan. "You didn't have to help us," she said softly, but the sentence felt hollow even as she spoke it. Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared ahead, jaw tight, as if studying some enemy only he could see. When he finally spoke, it was quieter than she expected. "I know what it's like to lose someone on a mission. Sometimes you get there a minute too late, sometimes a second, and sometimes you get there in time to carry the guilt anyway." She watched him, realizing that everything he did, the swiftness, the precision, the deadly calm, came from more than training. It came from loss. Ranger shifted beside him, as if sensing the shift in the air. Lena reached down and touched the dog's head gently. "He looks like he's been through things," she murmured. Ethan's lips twitched, half a smile, half a memory. "He has. Saved my life once, maybe twice. Hard to keep count." Before she could reply, the clinic door swung open. Dr. Thorne stepped out, removing his gloves slowly. Lena froze. Ethan stood. The vet didn't speak immediately. His silence was heavy, deliberate. Finally, he nodded. "Scout made it through the worst of it. I won't promise anything beyond tonight, but he's fighting harder than I expected. You can see him for a moment." Relief nearly crushed Lena. Her knees weakened, and she braced a hand on the wall. Ethan steadied her without a word. They entered the room. Scout lay on the metal table, wrapped in tubing and blankets, breathing shallowly. The little dog's eyes fluttered open for the briefest moment, finding Lena, then Ethan, then Ranger. Something flickered in that gaze. Not fear, not pain, but a stubborn spark refusing to go out. Ethan felt something tighten unexpectedly in his chest. He knew the look. He had seen it on soldiers refusing to die on desert floors. Lena whispered promises Scout couldn't hear, promises she desperately needed to say. The vet gave them a few minutes, then ushered them out gently. "Let him rest," he said. "If he makes it through dawn, the odds will change." Outside, the snow had begun again. Ethan led Lena to the parking lot, but before either could speak, a battered sedan pulled up near the curb. A man stepped out. Detective Marshal Rowan, a mid-level officer with the Denver Police Department. He wasn't someone Ethan knew, but Lena stiffened when she saw him, not in fear, but recognition of a complication arriving too soon. Rowan had a reputation. Sharp mind, sharper tongue, and the burden of too many cases where justice slipped through cracks, money had widened. Tonight, fatigue weighed heavy on his shoulders. "Brooks," Rowan said, rubbing his temples as if fighting off a headache. "We got a problem. The Red Vipers filed complaints, claims of excessive force. They're saying you provoked the fight." Lena's eyes darkened. "They tried to kill me. They tried to kill Scout." Rowan raised both hands slightly, a gesture of warning, not dismissal. "I'm on your side, but we can't ignore this. Internal Affairs will open a file first thing tomorrow. You need to be prepared." His gaze shifted to Ethan. "And I need the name of your friend here." Ethan met the man's stare with a still calm that bordered on unnerving. "I'm no threat to your department?" Rowan exhaled. "That's not an answer. Look, Brooks, these guys, the Vipers, they're connected. Someone behind them is paying to make this disappear, and not in your favor. If they're moving this fast, it's because tonight wasn't a random scuffle. It was a message." Ethan felt the weight of that truth settle into his ribs like a shard of ice. He had seen this pattern overseas, the intimidation, the pushback, the sudden retaliation when corruption felt threatened. Ranger growled softly, sensing the tension. Rowan continued, lowering his voice. "There's talk they might go after your home. They think breaking you will break the case. You need backup." "I have backup," Lena said quietly, glancing at Ethan and Ranger. Rowan didn't comment on that, but his expression made it clear he wasn't reassured. The detective climbed back into his car, pausing only long enough to add, "Stay alert, all of you, and Brooks, don't stay alone tonight." Then he drove off into the snow. Lena looked at Ethan. "He's right. They won't stop." Ethan nodded once. "Then we stay ahead of them." The wind sharpened, as if agreeing. In the quiet that followed Rowan's departure, Ethan's gaze drifted to the clinic window where Scout rested. He felt the twin pull of responsibility and inevitability. The Red Vipers had crossed a line, not just with violence, but with intent. And he recognized the pattern of escalation too well. Lena shivered. "Do you think they'll come tonight?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. His breath formed a white plume in the cold as he studied the empty street, the drifting snow, the shadows stacked beneath every street lamp. Ranger stood absolutely still at his side, staring into the dark as if he could already smell what was coming. Finally, Ethan spoke, voice low. "If I were them, yes, they'd come tonight." And even as he said it, a distant engine rumbled from somewhere beyond the falling snow. Slow, deliberate, too familiar to be harmless, leaving a question hanging like frost in the air. Were they already here? Snow swept across the East Denver neighborhood in thin, wind-driven sheets, rattling shutters and hissing against the quiet row houses. Ethan Cole stood at Lena Brooks' small front porch, the storm swirling behind him like a restless warning. Ranger remained close, his posture alert but silent, every muscle tuned to the tension that prickled through the air. Inside the lights were dim, and Lena hovered near the living room window, peeking past the curtain with the unease of someone who had been told danger had a name, a direction, and a schedule, and all of it pointed at her. Ethan pushed the door closed behind him, tested the lock, then checked the deadbolt she already had. It wasn't enough. He scanned the frame and hinge line with the instinctive precision of a man who had evaluated entry points in far more hostile places. "This place isn't secure," he murmured. Lena tried to hide the tremor in her voice. It's all I've got." Ethan didn't argue, but Ranger gave a soft growl as if echoing his thoughts. Before anything else, Ethan walked through her home, living room, tiny kitchen, narrow hallway, bedroom, studying corners, shadows, and lines of approach. He paused near the rear door, where the snow piled high against the outside steps. One footprint trailed across the porch, half erased by snowfall. Not hers, not fresh, but not old either. He stepped back into the living room. Someone already scouted this place. Lena's breath caught. When? Before the storm really picked up. Maybe 20 minutes before Rowan talked to us. Ranger moved toward the rear of the house, nose low, tail stiff. He stopped beside the back door and touched it gently with his paw, a silent sign of unease Ethan had learned to trust. Lena swallowed hard. What do we do? Ethan didn't hesitate. We wait. We stay quiet. And we make them think they're the ones hunting. The next hour passed slowly, stretching like a wire pulled tight. Lena sat on the sofa, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. Ethan remained by the window, watching the street, the kind of stillness in his stance that came only from men who had learned patience in the deadliest environments. Ranger lay near the hallway, half resting, half listening, every shift of wind pulling at him. To break the silence, Lena finally spoke. "Rowan, do you trust him?" Ethan tilted his head slightly. "He's a good cop, but he's playing a losing game. The Vipers have someone above them who's buying influence." She nodded, not surprised. Her eyes drifted to the framed photo on her wall, her academy graduation. She remembered a time when she believed justice was as simple as writing the right report and doing the right thing. The storm outside grew harsher, the wind whistling through the alley like a warning. Then came the first knock. Soft. Too soft for anyone who actually wanted an answer. Lena stiffened. "Who?" Ethan raised a hand. "Don't speak." He moved to the door silently. Ranger joined him, muscles coiled. The knock came again. 3 taps, evenly spaced, like someone practicing patience they didn't have. Ethan leaned close to the peephole, but didn't peer through it. Never give your position away. Instead, he watched the small shadow under the door, 1 set of feet. But he didn't relax. One man meant bait or recon. Without warning, a voice drifted through the wood. Calm, rehearsed, too friendly. "Miss Brooks? It's Sergeant Darren Hale. Internal Affairs. I need a quick word." Lena blanched. "IA wouldn't come at night, and not during a storm." Ethan shook his head once. He had heard that tone before, in war zones where men posed as allies before detonating everything around them. He motioned her back toward the hallway. "Get down. Stay away from every window." The knock sharpened. "Officer Brooks, open up. This is official business." Ranger's growl deepened, low and dangerous. Ethan finally spoke through the door, his voice steady. "Badge number?" There was a pause, a single, fatal hesitation. "I don't have to give you that." "Wrong answer." Ethan glanced at Ranger. The dog took his position beside the couch, ready. The moment stretched thin until it snapped. A sudden metallic scrape sounded from the rear of the house. Someone at the back door. Ethan's jaw tightened. They were flanking the house. He moved quickly. "Lena, into the bedroom closet, now." She obeyed without arguing, adrenaline overtaking fear. Ranger stayed with Ethan, every sense locked forward. The back lock rattled. A muffled curse followed. Then the shattering crack of something heavy striking the doorframe. Ethan positioned himself along the wall, out of sight of the intruder's line of entry. His injured arm pulsed with fire, but his focus didn't waver. He reached for a metal flashlight from her kitchen drawer, not a weapon, but heavy enough to become one in close quarters. The back door burst inward. Snow blew into the kitchen, swirling around the two men who entered, a pair of red vipers, foot soldiers, faces half covered with scarves. Their movements were rough, impatient, nothing like the professionals who moved with silence. These were brawlers, men sent to make a statement, not to think. The first one stepped into the kitchen, scanning the darkened room. The second followed, gripping a crowbar. Ethan waited. Timing mattered. They moved farther inside, past the table, past the counter, toward the living room. Then Ethan struck. He swung the flashlight with brutal accuracy, cracking it against the base of the nearest man's skull. The attacker dropped instantly, limbs folding awkwardly. The second man spun toward the sound, but Ranger lunged first, slamming into him with a force that knocked the crowbar loose. The man crashed against the refrigerator, stunned long enough for Ethan to rip the radio from his belt and smash it underfoot. "Stay down," Ethan ordered, but the man instead reached for a knife. Ethan stepped forward and drove a swift kick into his ribs, sending him crumpling against the floor where Ranger pinned him with a warning growl. Then silence. Deadly. Pressurized. Wrong. Because Ethan knew there had been someone at the front door, too. He moved toward the living room, Ranger shadowing him. Lena cracked open the closet door, eyes wide, pulse racing. "Ethan, is it over?" she whispered. Before he could answer, 3 loud booms shook the front door. Heavy, powerful, not a knock, not a kick, a battering ram. Ethan's eyes hardened. They brought someone else. The wood splintered under the next strike. Ranger bristled. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Then came the final blow. A deafening crack as the frame shattered and the front door flew inward. Snow gusted into the living room, and a figure stepped through the broken doorway, larger, steadier, and far more prepared than the men Ethan had dropped. A new threat. And he wasn't alone. Ethan whispered, "Get behind me." And the chapter ended on the threshold of the unknown. Wind hammered against the broken doorway, sweeping snow into the living room in swirling white streaks. The temperature dropped instantly, filling the house with the sharp sting of winter as the front door lay splintered across the floor. Ethan Cole stepped forward, placing himself between Lena and the shadow filling the doorway. Ranger lowered into a tense stance, every instinct sharpening into something primal and precise. The figure stepped fully into the room. He didn't rush, didn't bark threats, didn't raise his weapon, not yet. His calm alone marked him as different from the thugs Ethan had already dropped. This was someone accustomed to entering rooms he expected never to leave quietly. A man shaped by violence, not reckless, but deliberate. His name, as Ethan would soon learn, was Cole Vanek. Vanek wasn't a Red Viper street enforcer. Rumors in law enforcement circles whispered about men like him. Freelancers called in when gangs wanted silence without witnesses at trial. People like Vanek operated between shadows, answering to money, not loyalty. Years earlier, he had reportedly survived a warehouse fire in Phoenix that had killed an entire crew of his employers. That event had left him with a reputation, a man who walked away from flames without looking back. His eyes swept the room, not frantic, but calculating. He took in the fallen attackers Ethan had subdued, the overturned chair, the flashlight dented from impact, and Ranger's poised frame. Then he focused on Ethan and something like recognition flickered, not of identity, but of capability, a silent acknowledgment between men who carried invisible scars. Vanek tilted his head slightly. "You made a mess," he said, voice low and steady. Ethan didn't answer. He shifted his weight, subtle, ready. His injured arm throbbed in warning, but adrenaline muted most of the pain. Vanek let out a slow breath, his boots crunching on the shattered wood. "They said you were a problem. I see they weren't exaggerating." Lena whispered from behind Ethan. "Ethan, he looks—" "I know," Ethan replied quietly. Vanek took another step deeper into the room. He didn't raise his weapon, but Ethan noticed the holstered pistol on his hip, the knife sheath tied to his boot, the compact taser hooked beside the belt buckle. He carried options, each chosen for silence or speed. Ranger growled deep and controlled. Vanek's gaze flicked toward the dog. "You trained?" Ranger gave another low, dangerous rumble. "To me," Ethan murmured, "he's more than trained." The tension snapped like an overstretched wire. Vanek lunged first, fast, almost inhumanly smooth, his hand reaching for his taser. Ethan moved just as fast, ramming his shoulder into Vanek's arm before it could fully clear the holster. The two collided hard, crashing against the wall. Pain flared through Ethan's injured arm, turning the edges of his vision briefly white. Vanek didn't hesitate. He drove an elbow toward Ethan's temple, but Ethan ducked, letting the strike glance off his shoulder. Ranger leapt, teeth bared, but Vanek kicked backward with brutal accuracy, sending the dog skidding across the floor with a yelp of surprise, not injury, just impact. Lena gasped and moved to help, but Ethan snapped, "Stay back!" Vanek grabbed a shard of wood from the broken frame, swinging it like a baton. Ethan deflected it with the metal flashlight still in his hand. The two men circled each other in the cramped living room, the storm outside howling like an audience demanding blood. "You're trained," Vanek said between breaths. "Not police, not military cops either." Ethan didn't answer, but his stance confirmed the assumption. Vanek grinned with a predator's satisfaction. "Figures. They sent me for an officer and a rookie dog. Didn't expect someone like you." He swung again. Ethan countered. Ranger rejoined, keeping low, looking for an opening that wouldn't put Ethan in the line of fire. Finally, Ethan managed to land a solid strike against Vanek's side, just enough to knock the wind from him. Vanek staggered, giving Ethan the seconds he needed to shove him toward the kitchen. But Vanek recovered too quickly. With a growl of frustration, he grabbed a heavy ceramic dish from the counter and hurled it. Ethan dodged, barely, but the dish shattered against the wall beside Lena. That was the moment Vanek's radio crackled. A rough voice came through the static. "Unit 4, status. We're 2 minutes out. Confirmed target." Lena's heart plummeted. "There's more of them." Vanek wiped a trickle of blood from his lip. "Back up. Bad luck for you." Ethan knew staying meant dying. He grabbed Lena's wrist. "We're moving, now." Ranger barked once, sharp, urgent, confirming the danger closing in. Ethan yanked Lena toward the back, pulling her past the unconscious attackers. They bolted through the kitchen, stepping over snow-blown inside, then out the ruined back door. The storm hit them like a wall, blinding wind slicing across their faces, snow thick as smoke. Behind them, Vanek cursed loudly and pushed through the broken frame. Ethan heard him shout into his radio. "They're running out the back. Push the alley." Lena clutched her coat close, her breath shaking in visible bursts. "Where do we go?" Ethan scanned the storm-dark alleyway. Away from roads, away from lights. They'll expect us to run straight. We won't. He turned toward the narrow path between houses and nodded sharply. Ranger stayed pressed to Ethan's side, each crunching step purposeful. The wind swallowed the world. Only their rapid breaths and the muffled storm filled the night. Behind them, faint but growing, came the unmistakable thrum of more vehicles, more voices, more danger. And among it all, Vanek's voice rising above the storm, cruel and certain, they won't get far. Ethan tightened his grip on Lena's hand, feeling the storm swallow them whole. "Keep moving," he whispered. "The night isn't done with us yet." Snow smothered the Denver outskirts in a thick white hush, turning the abandoned rail yard into a maze of ghostly shapes under the winter night. Ethan Cole led Lena Brooks and Ranger through the drifting cold, his breath sharp and controlled, every sense tuned to the danger closing in behind them. The storm acted like both shield and trap. Their footprints vanished quickly, but their visibility vanished just as fast. Lena clutched her coat tighter, teeth chattering not just from cold, but from the shock of running for her life. Behind the thin curtain of snow, shouts and the distant thrum of approaching engines drifted like echoes from another world. Ethan slowed near a half-collapsed maintenance shack, the only structure standing solid against the blizzard. He scanned the yard quickly. No lights, no silhouettes, no immediate movement. "We hold here," he said. Lena stared at him, disbelief flickering in her eyes. "Hold? Against what's coming? Ethan, there might be 8 or 10 men, Vanek included." Ethan met her gaze with a composure forged in sandstorms and firefights. "Running won't save us. Cover will." He looked down at Ranger. "You ready?" Ranger barked once, short, steady, fearless. The dog's resolve steadied Lena more than any words could. They slipped inside the shack. It smelled of rust, old oil, and the faint memory of years when trains still ran through this quiet corner of the city. Ethan moved quickly, barricading the door with a rusted tool cabinet, shoving crates against the windows, clearing the center of the room. Lena stood near the wall, forcing her breath to slow, her mind to sharpen. "We need help," she whispered. "If I call Rowan—" "He'd never reach us in time," Ethan cut in, "and the Vipers might intercept the call." Lena shut her eyes briefly. Fear mingled with the guilt she still carried from the alley, from Scout's blood staining her hands, from letting the Vipers corner her in the first place. She forced the thoughts away. This wasn't the time for regret. A faint crunch sounded outside. Boot against snow. Ranger bristled. Ethan raised one hand, palm down, a signal for silence. Another crunch, then 2 more. Vanek's voice rolled through the storm like a slow-moving blade. "Cole, you made this harder than it had to be." His tone carried something dangerous. Not anger, but amusement. "You're good, I'll give you that. But nobody outruns the dark forever." Ethan exhaled slowly. "He's trying to draw us out." Lena swallowed. "Is it working?" "Not yet." They waited, breath shallow. The footsteps faded, then grew louder a second later, from the opposite side of the shack. Vanek was testing their positions, measuring. Ethan whispered, "They'll flank soon. When they do, stay low, stay behind me. Ranger takes signals only." Ranger's ears twitched in acknowledgement. A sudden crack split the silence. Gunfire. A bullet punched through the thin shack wall, embedding itself in a metal beam with a metallic scream. Lena dropped instantly, Ranger pressed flat, ready. Ethan stayed upright, aware, counting seconds between shots. "They're probing," he muttered. Another burst followed, faster, coordinated. Splinters rained from the door. Van Eck barked an order from outside, and two more shooters repositioned. "Ranger," Ethan said softly, "on my left." The dog shifted immediately. Ethan positioned himself at the edge of a cracked window. He didn't have a gun, but he knew how to read movement like language. A shadow flickered through the snow. One of Van Eck's men trying to approach the side entrance. Ethan swung a metal pipe, snatched from the shack floor, through the window opening. It collided with the shadow with a wet thud, followed by a pained yell, one down, but not for long. Van Eck's calm voice rose again. "You've got spirit, Cole. Shame to waste it." Then the ram slammed into the front door, once, twice. Each hit shuddered through the shack. The makeshift barricade wouldn't hold long. Ethan grabbed Lena's wrist. "Get ready." The third hit blew the door inward, crates skidding across the floor as cold air blasted inside. Van Eck stepped through the swirling snow, weapon raised, movement controlled. Behind him, 3 red vipers fanned out, all armed, all steady despite the storm. Ethan pushed Lena behind a steel cabinet. Ranger lunged, teeth bared, forcing the nearest thug to stumble. Ethan threw a crate sideways, knocking another man off balance. But Van Eck didn't flinch. His gaze locked on Ethan like a predator marking its prey. "You should have stayed out of this," Van Eck said. "No," Ethan replied. "You should have." Van Eck moved first. Ethan countered. The room exploded into chaos, shouting, metal clashing, Ranger snarling. Lena found herself face to face with one of the thugs, raising his pistol toward Ethan. Instinct surged before fear. She grabbed a fallen wrench and swung it hard into the man's wrist. The gun clattered away. Ranger immediately pinned the man down, teeth grazing his arm in warning. Ethan and Van Eck grappled, each strike landing with brutal clarity. Van Eck slammed Ethan's injured arm into the wall, drawing a strangled breath from the seal. Ethan retaliated with a headbutt that staggered Van Eck long enough for Ethan to regain footing. But Van Eck recovered fast. Too fast. He drew his knife, small, sharp, meant for finishing. "End of the line," he muttered. Before the blade could descend, flashing through the cold, Ranger launched himself with a roar, slamming into Van Eck's shoulder. The knife skidded across the floor. Ethan seized the opening, twisting Van Eck down and pinning him with the last reserve of strength left in his battered body. Lena shouted, "Ethan, behind you!" One remaining thug raised his weapon, hands trembling. He fired, but the shot never found its mark. A second gunshot cracked from behind the shack, and the thug collapsed. The doorframe filled with a new figure, Detective Rowan, breath fogging, cheeks red from the storm. His service weapon trembled slightly, but his stance held firm. "You really know how to ruin a night?" Rowan muttered. Backup lights appeared behind him, blinking red and blue, slicing through the snowstorm. The fight drained out of the room like air from a punctured lung. Van Eck, pinned beneath Ethan, gave one final bitter smile. "This isn't the end, Cole." Ethan tightened his grip. "It is for you." Rowan cuffed the remaining vipers as officers swept the shack. Lena collapsed into a chair, shaking but alive. Ranger pressed his head into her lap, trembling from exertion, but unharmed. Ethan leaned against the wall, exhaustion pulling at every muscle. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded weakly. "Thanks to you. To all of you." Rowan exhaled heavily. "The moment I saw your house torn apart, I knew where they'd push you. I gambled you'd head for the rail yard." "You gambled right," Ethan murmured. As the officers dragged Vanek away, the storm outside began to soften, as if the night finally loosened its grip. Lena stood between Ethan and Ranger, the weight of everything settling into something that felt like fragile, tentative hope. Then her phone buzzed, a message from the clinic. One line: "Scout is awake, asking for you." Tears filled her eyes, bright against the cold. She grabbed Ethan's hand, impulsive, grateful, still trembling. Ethan squeezed back gently, Ranger barking once, as if celebrating a victory far greater than the fight. They stepped out of the ruined shack into the snow, together at last. Not hunted, not afraid, and finally, safe. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought overseas. They happen in the quiet corners of our everyday lives. And just when the night feels darkest, God sends a spark of courage to remind us we're not alone. A tiny K9 that refused to give up, a wounded SEAL who chose to stand for what was right, a miracle born from bravery, loyalty, and faith. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment what moved you most and subscribe to stay with a community that believes in courage and compassion. May God bless every person watching, guiding your steps, calming your storms, and reminding you that light always finds a way. Amen.